Yo, what's up guys? Lowell here. I'm back. I have nothing else to do, so screw it. I'm gonna make a light water arcane guide for PvE for TBC. I realized that I haven't really played it that much, so it's kind of weird that I'm making a guide, but I feel like I played it enough, and the expansion is not exactly like, you know, it doesn't really have that many things that change, I feel like, the spec that much. So I'm going to talk... Actually, this will be kind of like a mage guide with the exception of frost. So I'm going to talk about my version of arcane and my version of fire. So I have two specs here. And these are the specs that I personally feel like are the best. But there's a little bit of leeway with both. So first of all, this is like the default arcane. I'm going to turn this music just a tiny bit so I can think. Okay, so that, man, there's so much to go with the mage. I have so much fun. It's gonna be fun to explain all this. Okay, so mage to me is a lot of untapped potential because it's one of those classes that people meme on that, like, or you know, that mage is like a support or you only really want one. And maybe everybody I was playing against in the private server sucked, but I don't think so, because I looked at like in-game DPS and I looked at like what I was already pulling off, and it was pretty insane. So I can only imagine what the future holds. So here's one thing. I found that there's like an infinite number of ways to scale your mana pool into DPS as arcane. So for one, I guess I could pull it up here. Let me see. TBC mage spells. Sorry, I probably should have this prepared. Hopefully the whiteness doesn't fucking delete your eyeballs like it's deleting mine right now. Let's see. Arcane Blast. Okay, doesn't work like that. Is there an Arcane Blast here? I don't know. There we go. Okay. Just so you can have a look at the spell and see what it does. So this is Arcane Blast. This is primarily the way that you're probably going to DPS as an Arcane Mage. So here's the difference between the specs. Fire is going to spam Fireball first. And obviously I'm going to mostly be talking about single target DPS because that's kind of what matters. In my opinion, nothing beats Arcane for AoE DPS if done properly. With the exception of a really geared Seed of Corruption Warlock who's maybe got like a bop pet, you know? So it's just got a paladin ready to bop him at all points in time. But in a realistic setting, even Warlocks don't beat me. Because the main thing about that Arcane has over Warlocks, it's this right here. When you actually start to get so good at the game that you do so much DPS, threat becomes a real issue. And that's actually the new limiter on what you can even pull off as a DPS. And we have one of the highest threat reductions innately, 40%. So I think people have always thought of Arcane as like pulling a bunch of threat, but I think it's because people don't spec on the Arcane subtlety. I don't really know, but Arcane doesn't pull that much threat at all, which is really nice because it means that in a 5-man dungeons, which is where you're gonna spend, by the way, most of your time playing PvE, grinding out all your gear and shit, the badges and whatnot, all your rep. We're gonna be in 5-mans a lot, okay? Like the majority of your WoW experience TBC is gonna be 5-mans in my opinion. I don't think there's like a better DPS. I bring improved Amplify or Dampen Magic. I give everyone all the food they could ever want and water. I bring ports, Arcane Intellect, and I'm the highest AoE DPS in the game. And every time we get to a boss, I'll have Icy Veins and Arcane Power up. So you know I'm deep dicking that boss. Like, I've got Burst, I've got AoE, I don't make aggro, I bring lots of support, I can still CC if I want a little bit, I bring Sheep, I have Frost Nova, Cone of Cold for kiting and slowing down things. Like, my usefulness doesn't end. And Mana Shield is like super underrated. I got to the point where my gear was so good, and this is just pre-Kara, by the way. Like, Kara, After I got Kara-geared, I wasn't fully Kara-geared either, but I just have like 14k mana. Like in raid, I forgot what I got up to, but it was nuts. It was like 15, 16k. I could just mana shield infinitely. Like it blocks like 1,000, 1,500 damage or something, like 1.5k. I'm randomly super tanky, and this is private server damage, so like almost everything like can one shot you. But yeah, being able to just mana shield all the time, even though it costs a global, is like nuts, right? So I don't know. That's one thing you have over the other specs, right? Other specs don't want to be building lots of mana. And I mean, I've almost thought about even saying like fuck the group and putting 2 points in the mana shield instead of improved Amplify or Dampen Magic. I guess it depends on your raid setting. I guess I should go through the spec. I'm sorry, my brain's all over the place. Let's go through the spec. So first we're going to talk about Arcane, then I'm going to talk about how I would play Fire. And for all you Frost lovers out there, I really don't care. The spec thematically just doesn't interest me. I don't even know if it's good or not. I've never liked Frost ever. I've never played Frost anytime I've ever played a mage since vanilla. I just never liked it. I don't know what it is. I just thought it was always gimmicky, and it was like what everybody played in PvP, and I don't know, maybe I just got killed by a few too many Frost mages to really like the spec. But this is the Arcane spec. You don't even grab slow. Your last talent unfortunately is useless, so let's just walk through it. So this is the meta, how most people put their points if they're an Arcane mage, and I'll explain why. So 2 points, Arcane Subtlety, reduces chance targets resist your spells and reduces your threat by 40%. Obviously a no-brainer. Arcane Focus is another reason why Arcane is very strong early game, despite the reason why people think it isn't. Reduce the chance targets can resist your spells by 10%. That's 10% spell hit for free. 10%. 1-0. That's a lot of spell hit rating you don't need now. Next up, we get to Arcane Concentration. Clear casting. So it's a 10% chance that anytime a damage spell hits a target, you get your next spell free, no matter the mana cost, right? This means it can proc off any rank of spell. So your DPS doesn't stop even when you run out of mana, because rank 1 Arcane Explosion is so cheap that you can actually spam rank 1 Arcane Explosion, fishing for a clear casting proc, and then cast like a full rank Flame Strike or Blizzard if you want. And it's like I've actually done, just for fun, like to see like what my DPS is, and my AoE DPS went down to like a half or 40%, with 0 mana, you know, on like 5 ads. And I just thought that was nuts that I was still able to pull off like 1,000 DPS while having actually no mana, just using Arcane Explosions and casting Flame Strikes. So yeah, clear casting is going to be the only moving parts of your spec. It is the most interesting, fascinating part, and a really, really good mage will know how to take advantage of clear casting. And there's all kinds of things you can do with clear casting, and I'll kind of get into that in a bit. Next up for the next row, these are like your extra points that you have to throw to unlock some stuff later on, I think. But I think one thing people really underestimate, actually I would say, if I had to create a list, like a top 5 things that people in vanilla WoW and classic or TBC never take advantage of, is it's not knowing when to put on Amplify Magic or Dampen Magic from the mage. It is one of the strongest buffs in the game, and to increase this by 50%, one of the things people don't realize is most ads in TBC don't do constant spell damage. They have like a spell they cast every once in a while, right? So if something hits your tank one time very infrequently, if you have Amplify Magic, that they might take like 300 more damage, right? Okay, that sucks. 300, maybe 400 more damage. Okay, you know, that's a medium amount, but you know what? Every single heal is going to get like 240 healing power more. Or like 360, I think, after the 50% increase. 360 healing power. That's a third of what people think is required of healers to enter Karazhan. That is a significant increase to a healer's amount. That's the difference between a healer who just hit 70 and a healer who's basically fully normal geared with some heroic pieces. Like, it is the biggest power increase. I really can't explain it. So having Amplify Magic on everybody in your group at all times, improved Amplify Magic, it's insane. It's probably the most underrated buff of all time ever. And you know, I know this as a healer. I would always ask my mages to Amplify Magic, and they would always say the same thing. Are you memeing? And I never quite understood why. It's like a meme. It's like considered bad for some reason. I don't get it. It's insane. It's insane. There's almost no situations where it gets your group killed. And the sheer times it will apply to heals versus the amount of instances it applies the damage is like 50 to 1. Obviously, it's worth it. And if you absolutely have to, for whatever reason, just to like survive a big nasty hit, you could put improved dampen magic on everybody in the group just to survive a hit. If you absolutely have to, you know, you wouldn't really want to, but you can. And when you're questing, and you don't have a healer, or when you're in duels or world PvP, you always have dampen magic on. And to have improved dampen, I mean, you'll notice the difference. It's insane. If someone doesn't even have that much spell power to begin with, especially like dot classes, I will win against warlocks just because of mage armor and improved dampen magic. And then I just spam mana shield on myself. Literally my rotation against them is I get them to kick me on poly. I'm not even a PvP player, by the way, so maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, but I get them to kick me on poly, and then my rotation is literally this: Arcane Blast, mana shield, Arcane Blast, mana shield, and I have so much fucking mana, and I have Icy Veins and Arcane Power rolling that I can literally just eat every single bit of their damage while DPSing them down. And it's like the funniest thing, like, you know, even if they fear me, dot me, like I can last so long at Ice Block or their fear, come out, get off another hit. Like it's funny, like I'm not even spec for PvP. You know, if you're spec for PvP, maybe you'd want like magic absorption. By the way, I haven't really spent enough time to really think about if this is potentially useful, because if you as an arcane mage are spamming intellect, I always thought about what's the chance that you could completely resist something and restore. Does this get, let's see, does this get 5%? Yeah, it does. It increases all resistance by 10 and causes spells you fully resist to restore 5% of your total mana. That could be quite a bit. I mean, you could easily get, you know, early on like 14k mana. What is that? Math is hard. Is that like 900 mana? No, it's like 700 mana, right? 10% of 14,000 be 1.4k. So 700 mana, yeah. Obviously that would be nuts. Even just if you could get this proc a couple times, the 5 points would be worth it. But let's just assume that that's not going to be a thing. It definitely would be a thing for tanking. I think as a mage, you actually tank one mage boss in the ogre place. So I think you have to change your spec for that and use a combination of like mana shielding. You spell steal their buff. You take this, you get a little bit of resistances. It hits pretty hard, and I think he casts Fireball on you. So use a combination of like Flame Shield, Mana Shield, Spell Steal, with like a little bit of Fire Res, and that's how you literally tank a boss. It's kind of funny. Okay, moving on. Sorry. This is a garbage talent. Even though they buffed it from 50 to 100%, I think from Classic, it's still bad, even though we stack all int. Ironically, this would be like 1,000 armor in raid when you get fully geared, and that's almost worth it, except for the fact that you're a DPS, right? So, and 1,000 armor is nice. This might be like 5% more damage reduction, maybe, against physical stuff, because you have just such little to begin with. But ultimately, I don't know. I'm such a glass cannon mindset. Like, I'm here to do the most DPS. I'm here to ook. It's gonna be like the original version anyway, so I doubt things are gonna hit that hard. But this might help you on like, I don't know, like the falling rocks in, was it Gruul's Lair? What is that boss? I don't know. Anyways, improved mana shield is actually pretty solid, but you know, it's a DPS loss. Improved counter spells for, obviously, for PvP. 3 points Arcane Meditation. It allows 30% of your mana regeneration to continue while casting. I believe Mage Armor is 30% as well. So together that makes 60%. Or maybe Mage Armor is 40% and then together makes 70%. Either way, you get a lot of your mana regeneration to continue while casting as a arcane mage, or as a mage in general, because I think most other mage specs would probably go down this tree this far. Arcane Mind is 15% intellect. Obviously, that's insane. Presence of Mind is a prereq for some of this other stuff later on, but you find some pretty good use for Presence of Mind. In my opinion, it's a good opener. Because your first... So the way Arcane Blast works is its cast time is long, but with each cast, it gets shorter. I believe it's 0.3 seconds each time. So by the time you're on your third stack, it becomes a 1.5 second cast, but its mana cost is tripled. Now here's a little bit of an issue. Well, not an issue. This is a good thing. This is the whole reason why you're the best DPS in the game, by the way. This simple reason. You still get the 2.5 second spell power coefficient math. So you're still getting like, what is it? Math is hard. It's like 2.5 out of 3.5. You're still getting 71.42% of your spell power coefficient, and you're getting this at every 1.5 seconds, right? So that's very good. And with stuff later on, like, and in theory, you can roll the damage out even faster because you're gonna have double icy veins. And you'll also have Arcane Power, which, if you think about it, Arcane Power actually just kind of functions as more haste. So it says your spells deal 30% more damage while costing 30% more mana to cast. Interestingly, this isn't actually like a DPS increase for a long fight because you're spending more mana to do more damage up front. But in combination with Icy Veins, you pop them both at the same time, which increases your spell haste by 20% and prevents you from losing interruption while casting. These two will be the bulk of your mana usage. When you pop both these and you really go ham with these Arcane Blast, you will use a large chunk of your mana. And then when you pop your second one, because of Cold Snap, you'll probably be at the bottom of your mana pool, or you should be at the bottom of your mana pool. And I suggest using the last bit of your Icy Veins, not to actually do damage, but to start the evocation cast, so then the evocation cast goes by a lot faster. One issue is you lose a significant portion of your DPS spending 8 seconds casting evocate in a fight. And if you can speed that up, you want to. Speeding up the rate at which you Arcane Blast isn't like the best in the world. Oh yeah, one interesting thing about Arcane Blast. It's the most mana efficient DPS spell like in the game on its first, before any stacks, right? But it has this 8 second, you could almost call it debuff, where the mana cost keeps increasing and the cast time goes down. So in theory, if we could just have Arcane Blast on its own without this, our whole build would change. We wouldn't be so stuck on intellect, we'd be going spell damage. But we don't have that. We have the opposite. We have a bunch of haste for free at the cost of mana, which means that intellect and mana pool becomes our currency now, right? It's really, I don't know how to quite explain it, but it's really fascinating to me that that's the way so there's just something about a DPS player stacking all intellect and all mana and just hemorrhaging these massive amounts of mana to do damage. Like, the idea of it is really appealing to me. I don't know why. I've always been fascinated with Arcane as like, even as like a kid in high school, just the idea of like that concept. Anyways, I'm taking forever to go through here. This is more damage reduction. We don't take that. This is more DR for PvP. Like, a lot of this is like PvP stuff, like PvP, 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 PvP. Wand damage, but honestly, you shouldn't really be having the wand. If you're having the wand, you've kind of fucked up. It happens every once in a while, but I don't think it's worth it. Increase your spell damage and critical strike chance by 3%. Okay, whatever. Pretty straightforward. This one's big. Increases the critical strike chance of any spell cast with clear casting by 30%. This is where the minigame comes in. Because you know the next spell you're going to cast after you get clear casting is probably going to be a crit, because plus 30% is pretty massive, and you usually have around 30% anyways, right? So, it means like you're going to have a 60% chance to crit. And then if we continue down here, your critical strike damage bonus of all spells is increased by 50%. So now your crits crit for 1.75 times damage, which is really nice. So it's like almost 2x like how retail is. So these crits really matter, right? And you usually want to use it with Cone of Cold, and I'll sort of explain why in a bit. But also you got to remember the spell is free. And so like in AoE situations, I always save my Presence of Mind for when I get a clear casting proc, and then I have a macroed in at cursor Flame Strike, right? Because that Flame Strike is going to do work with that crit. And it's free, right? That's the main thing. Flame Strike costs considerably a lot of mana, a lot more than Cone of Cold. So the DPS for the deep damage done per proc of clear casting is higher, which is really what you want, right? If you're going to cast a spell instantly, why not it be the higher damage spell, right? Theoretically, Blizzard is a higher damage spell per proc, but Blizzard's DPS is lower than just Arcane Exploding. So the whole idea here is we're trying to crank the damage. And the highest DPS and highest efficiency button you can push with clear casting proc is Flame Strike if Presence of Mind is off cooldown. If you can ensure that every dot tick will tick, then Flame Strike does beat out Cone of Cold just a tiny bit. It definitely beats it out if you've decided to go 20 points, or to go points in fire rather than frost. I'll get into that in a little bit. Anyways, so you've got good crit damage. That's good. Arcane Power, I talked about that earlier, sort of just functions as a way to auction off more mana for more damage. Not really an efficiency increase, but later on when you start getting more mana than you can even use in a fight, Arcane Power and Icy Veins are the reason why you can still turn mana into DPS. Mind Mastery increases spell damage by up to 25% of your intellect. Obviously insane. One of the reasons why intellect is just worth so much for Arcane Mage. Okay. So now we get to a conundrum. Let's pretend these points here are not in Frost. So there's actually a couple ways that you can take these points early game. So let's assume that you don't have the mana to properly use a second icy, or to use Icy Veins, and it's early game, right? You can actually go deep Arcane and still get Icy Veins. I think it looks something like this. Let me see. Yeah, it looks like this. And I did this before. I actually played this. I had a lot of fun with it. So here's one spec. So this, your filler is Arcane Missiles. So as you begin to get lower on mana, so let me spell out what would happen. You start the fight, you wait for the tank to get aggro, right? You're slowly casting Arcane Blast so you can get your stacks up. When the tank finally has aggro, you go ham. Arcane Power, Icy Veins, it's Arcane Blast, 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 blast until you're evocate, blast, 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 blast. When you get to like under half mana, and you know the fight still has a long time to go, because you know sometimes bosses take a long time to kill, now your filler is Arcane Missiles. And believe it or not, Arcane Missiles will do more damage per mana spent than triple stack Arcane Blast. But regular Arcane Blast is still more efficient. So your rotation becomes Arcane Blast, Missiles. And then you usually have to go into another Missiles because the debuff or buff from Arcane Blast is 8 seconds, whereas the cast time Missiles is 5. And each time Missiles fires 1 every second. With Empowered Missiles, your Arcane Missile spell gains another 45% from your bonus spell damage, but its mana cost is increased. No biggie deal on the mana cost. It's a pretty efficient spell as it is. And then up here, you can ensure that there's no pushback while channeling Arcane Missiles. So this can be very good on certain fights where there's a lot of pushback. And it's definitely good on like 5-mans and stuff where there's a lot of AoE happening to your group. So I played this spec for a while. Now, when your gear gets better, by the way, you don't have to start with the spec, but I actually think it's okay. And it's definitely better for when you're lower item level, when you're weaker, when your gear is worse. I kind of hate that the item level, but yeah. Because then you know, when you're getting attacked by mobs and you're questing, these two put together are very nice. You don't get Arcane Blast for a very long time. So you'll probably be spec'd into missiles until like 67 or something when you finally get Arcane Blast. Maybe it's like 65. I don't remember what exactly that was. Anyways, so that's that build. There's another build where your filler is actually fire instead of frost. And so you're casting Fireball. And this is very uncommon, but it actually can work quite well. And I've like looked at the math. You also get Palm Pyro, which is nice. I think it looks something like this. Let's see. Yeah. So you could theoretically pick up Scorch and fulfill that role for the group if you wanted. I wouldn't want to, obviously. But yeah, it kind of looks something like this. I think you can actually still manage to grab. I don't know if you can actually manage to still get Icy Veins. Yeah, because these are the two that really matter here. You might be able to. Yeah, you still can. So it would look something like this. This would be the fire filler, in my opinion. You could go deep fire for more AoE damage and a little bit more single target efficiency, and say screw it to Icy Veins. Because remember, at the end of the day, Icy Veins is just a mana to damage conversion. And so if you don't have enough gear to support that mana usage, then you should out of luck. Also, Icy Veins doesn't really do anything for you DPS wise, because it's just giving you haste. And so if you don't have a trinket to combine that with, like a trinket that temporarily gives you spell damage, then it doesn't really matter. And even when you combine Icy Veins to Arcane Power, your efficiency hasn't gone up. You're just casting more, like you're casting faster and spending more mana to do the same damage to mana ratio. That's the main thing that I want you guys to take away from this. If you're a healer, you innately understand how Arcane works, because it's just mana to damage ratio. That's all that matters, right? Fire and Frost have the luxury of not going sort of naturally because of built-in things like Master of Elements, right? And their spells just cost such a small amount anyways, and so with raid buffs and a little bit of gearing, their mana really isn't an issue. Whereas our mana directly turns into increased DPS because how absurd Arcane Blast is. I mean, every 1.5 seconds you're losing 600 mana. Obviously you can't sustain that very long, and you definitely can't sustain that when you're Arcane Powering and Icy Veins. And if you're the Frost build, you can Icy Veins twice. So what I think the play is, to be honest, is I think you maybe go this in the beginning. You go this, or you go Arcane Missile build for your filler. Okay? As you get more and more gear, you translate, you leave that behind, and you pick up the other stuff over here that look like this. Let's see. I think it's this. There you go. So it looks like this. And so now your filler is, you won't have much of a filler, but if you have to use filler, it's going to be Frostbolt. And Frostbolt is pretty efficient as far as damage goes, and the rotation is pretty simple. It's 2 Frostbolts and an Arcane Blast. Arcane Blast, Frostbolt, Frostbolt. Arcane Blast, Frostbolt, Frostbolt. Because Frostbolt, I think, will take 2.5 or 3 seconds, and then the Arcane Blast is going to take 2.5. So it works its way out to where just as you're about to finish Arcane Blast, you lose the charge on it. So that's pretty cool. There is something I was sort of fiddling around with earlier, where you keep on 3 charges of Arcane Blast and you use your clear casting procs on it. And I was sort of getting pretty good with it. Every single time clear casting procced, I would just cast Arcane Blast. And if you get really, really good lucky synergy, you can kind of just keep using it on triple stack Arcane Blast. It doesn't save you much time, but it's sort of an interesting idea. Another thing you could do. So here's one benefit, by the way. There's also kind of another mixture, by the way, of spells. So one thing about if you go the deep Arcane Missiles build is you can use the clear casting procs on Arcane Missiles, because base Arcane Missiles cost a lot more mana than even rank 3 Arcane Blast. I think it's a little bit more mana usage, right? So what you can start doing is you after your first evocate, you know you're in mana saving mode now because you don't have an evocate to bail you out, right? And let's say the fight still has a long time to go. So now you could be spamming Arcane Blast, but every single time you get a clear casting proc, you hit cancel cast and you channel missiles, right, as a way to save mana. And then you wait like 1 second for your debuff to end, and then recast Arcane Blast. Like 2 times, 3 times, and you're praying for a clear casting proc so you can cast missiles. I think Arcane is one of the most fascinating specs when your gear isn't as good, because there's so many ways to take advantage of the clear casting proc and to work around this 8-second debuff on Arcane Blast to really come up with some unique usages and ways to really take advantage of this clear casting, right? You always want to cast your most expensive spells with clear casting, or rather do the most DPS, cast your most damaging spell, I guess is a better way to rephrase it, right? So yeah. Okay, I think that's enough about talents. I think I will now explain the fire build a little bit. So here's the fire build, and I worked a long time to kind of theorycraft these talents out, and it might seem kind of weird. 33 points in Arcane, 28 in fire. Kind of a bizarre mixture, right? Now, the Arcane stuff's pretty straightforward. You just grab, as much stuff. You're only able to get 4 points in Arcane Mind, 2 points in Arcane Potency, which is fine. But the main thing is you got all the way down to Spell Power, and you got all the way down to Arcane Power. Now, the reason you grab Arcane Power is fire doesn't have mana issues. So this is just a DPS increase, basically, right? Makes sense enough. Also, Arcane Power with Presence of Mind, Pyroblast is a really fun opener. So, generates a lot of threat, but you do have Burning Soul. So, yeah. Okay, so the main thing with the fire build, obviously you're casting Fireball. The main thing is that you have this 50% increase, right? So it goes like this. The 50%, because normally you have 150% crit damage, this gets buffed by 50%, so this becomes 75. So now your crits do 175. Okay, following me here? But Ignite says your crits do 40% of their spell damage over 4 seconds. So you take this 175 and you plus 40%. So now your crits do 245% damage. That's more crit damage than anyone in the game has. Even DPS that have 100% critical strike damage from talents are only doing 2x. You're doing 2.5 times. So your crits are madness. Like, they mean everything, right? Which means that you want critical strike rating, obviously. Intellect still gives crit rating, so it's pretty good. But you don't really need that much of it. You do get a bonus to your intellect here, so that's pretty solid. So it's not worthless. What else about the build? You still have clear casting procs, which still give 20% increased critical strike chance, right? And so that in combination with this, which is 10%, means that your flame strikes still get the 30% on a clear casting proc. So you can pretty much ensure that flame strikes will absolutely destroy. Your AoE rotation is the exact same as full arcane, with the exception of Cone of Cold. Oh, that's another thing I should have mentioned. With deep arcane, your AoE rotation is this. It's assuming you have all your cooldowns. You pop your cooldowns, your arcane exploding until you get a clear casting proc. You Presence of Mind Flame Strike. Hopefully you still had up Arcane Power. It will absolutely destroy everything. You keep Arcane exploding. If you get another clear casting proc, you want your next clear casting proc, assuming there's already a Flame Strike dot on the ground, to be Cone of Cold. Why? It's got 30% increased critical strike chance. You probably have 30% already, so there's a 60% chance to crit. Right here, you get 100% damage to frost spells. So there's a very high chance that you are going to do 225% critical strike damage on that Cone of Cold, and it's got 60% chance to crit. It will remove ads, like it will delete things. It was very often where we are killing 6 ads, Cone of Cold, and that Cone of Cold will do 12k damage because it's doing 2k to every single one of those ads. I mean, just imagine being able to push a button and boom, you did 12k. It was very addicting. Like, it was watching this and my screen blowing up in numbers. It was so much fun. And then if I could properly pull off, if I got a little bit of RNG with the clear casting Flame Strike instant into another instant Cone of Cold, I could easily see 4k DPS on just as little as 5 adds. And it blew people's mind away how fast I killed mobs. Like, you know, enemies have like 20k health. So, you know, just to do that kind of DPS, I mean, I was like 60% of the group's damage, 60, 70% per pool. It's just nuts. Anyways, back to the fire build, okay? So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, do you go farther down Arcane, do you go farther down Fire? But this is the winning combination. The only thing flexible here is the Scorch, Improved Scorch. If you have somebody else who's already playing Improved Scorch, you obviously could take points out and rearrange them a little bit differently. I think it goes something like, maybe like this. It's about all you can do, right? These 2 points could have gone into Incinerate or to max out Flame Strike, depending on what you want out of your playstyle. The Pyroblast is not really needed, but it just feels good to push it in your opener with all your other buttons. But ultimately, it's not needed. This point can be spent somewhere else. You're only going to be casting like a Scorch every like 30 seconds, and you don't really Fire Blast at all. It's okay. Like, Fire Blast is alright, but it's not, in my opinion, it's not really that much of a DPS increase over Fireball, and it does cost a lot of mana. And you want to avoid building your character with mana. You want just enough mana to last the fight with an Evocate, right? And there's something to be said about making your character have enough mana to where maybe you don't even need to Evocate, because the math, while it is complicated, does exist, where if you can just build a little bit more intellect and a little bit more spirit or MP5 or whatever, or use a different consumable, however you need to go about it, right? To where you can avoid having to Evocate in the first place. 8 seconds of not doing damage is a long time to not do damage. It might just be worth your while to drop like 50 spell damage to pick up like 50 more int, and that might have ramifications over the course of the fight where you have enough mana to last that 15 more seconds, right? It's getting real nitty gritty, but Evocate is a nice tool, but it can actually like really stop your momentum of DPS. So I actually think builds where you don't Evocate as Fire would probably be better. And obviously as you get more and more gear, maybe you don't even need to Evocate. But yeah, I think this is the Fire build. You probably want 3 points in Scorch, just so you don't have to guess. I think knowing that you waiting until the 28-second on the debuff and then recasting, so you absolutely min-max it, boom, cast it with half second left. You know, maybe you don't play it that close just in case the enemy resists. Maybe you start scorching at like 26 seconds with 4 seconds remaining on the buff, so you can cast Scorch 2 times in case the boss resists or something. Would probably be better. But yeah, the whole point of this build is to build crit and take advantage of the synergy between Ignite and Spell Power. And the DPS from this spec, I did the math, and it's about like the Arcane build. And in some ways it has more of a future in that it doesn't have mana constraints, but I think Arcane probably scales better because it can use mana, right? So it's this kind of dichotomy between what's better, never having mana issues, but the only way to get more damage is basically just to build spell damage, or using mana to turn into more damage and scaling with spell damage, but mana is your limiter. It's a lot of tough math, and I wasn't able to quite figure it out. So, but ultimately, I tested both specs on the server, and I know I was using my Arcane gear for Fire, and Fire did about 10% less DPS on a 2-minute simulation on the dummy. So part of that was probably, I think it was like maybe 15% less, but I didn't have spell hit, and all my gear was geared towards intellect. So I think if I properly geared Fire properly, the DPS would be about the same. The thing is, I was forced to do a decent amount of filler and Evocate with the Arcane spec to make the 2-minute timer, because 2 minutes of just spamming Arcane Blast, let me tell you, that uses too much mana. Even I didn't have the gear for it. However, in Raid, with Raid buffs and Flask, I would have the gear to be able to Arcane Blast for 2 minutes straight. So my Arcane DPS would have been significantly higher. But then again, I would have had all the buffs for Fire as well. So at the end of the day, I think they're close enough to where you could play your preference. If you feel like putting up a Scorch every 30 seconds, casting Fireballs, taking advantage of the clear casting procs to weave in and be Fire Blast, would be probably what you would do with it, I would imagine. Obviously, you would use clear cast procs AoE for Flame Strike. Then yeah. And I think if played properly, you might be able to squeeze out more DPS AoE-wise, just because of how hard Flame Strike would clap. But yeah, it's relatively about the same. You wouldn't have the mana to do as much AoE sustained DPS as an Arcane Mage, but you do the same single target, and it's fire, so that's kind of cool. You'll have a little bit more threat issues as you only have 10% reduction on your threat instead of 40. So that's a significant difference, and that might be the reason why this isn't as good, because threat is a very real issue in TBC still. Okay, that's about all I can talk about with the talents. Let's get down to the nitty gritty with the stats and how stuff really kind of works out and what I found. So there's a lot that goes into my math, and I based all of my math around a 2-minute DPS fight. So, you know, take that for what you will. That being said, any longer than a 2-minute fight would only push intellect higher and higher, and spirit higher and higher, and mana per 5 higher and higher. Okay? So, already, intellect was worth a significantly larger portion, and this is speaking from Arcane only here, guys, than any other stat, and I feel like this is mostly about Arcane. If you want to play Fire, and you want to play the big crit Fire build, you know, it's pretty simple. Build enough intellect till you can sustain for any fight. You might have to have sets of gear where you have more intellect, or maybe you change up your consumables. I think would probably be the smarter play. But yeah, ultimately, like, what are you gonna do as Fire? You just build spell crit, right? I guess with Fire, the difficulty would be knowing what's better, spell crit over spell damage. And I think spell crit would be worth more. So spell crit for Arcane, to put in perspective, is worth 0.45 per point. Or rather, I did my system based off, I asked myself, how much percent DPS increase would I get if I got 10 of that stat? So for spell crit, for 10 spell crit, it was about 0.5% DPS increase. So for Fire, that number is going to be significantly higher, because it's not a 75% damage increase, it's a, what was it, 145% damage increase. So if 175 equals 0.5, then 245 is something like 0.8 maybe, which puts it almost twice as valuable as spell damage. So that would be pretty interesting. Also, Fire would want the trinket from Kara, where every 3 crits you shoot a lightning bolt out. That would synergize very well. So yeah, it would be really cool to try out the big Fire builds, and if you did it, you probably would want to be Troll for the haste, I imagine. Although I feel like that's probably equivalent to the 5% gnome buff, given all of this going on here. You know, there's a lot of synergies still with the 5%, and I imagine they still come out to being about the same, right? Because Fire still will have some mana issues on very long fights, you know. Okay, so there's a lot of things that went into my theory crafting. I try to factor them all in. I wanted to be talking about Arcane here. So first of all, the way it works is because of the gnome racial. I'm going to be playing gnome, obviously, and I think any Arcane Mage should be gnome. The bonus is too good. So with 5% from that, 15%, let's go back to the Arcane here. 15% intellect there, 5% int from the gnome racial, and 10% from kings. 10 intellect turns into 13.28 int. Okay, that comes out to about 200 mana, right? So we have 200 mana already. Now, in a 2-minute fight, you have to assume you're going to evocate, obviously. So this intellect with this mana actually turns into 320. Okay. So You remember that. So this intellect is giving us 320 more mana for the fight. Because of the way the scaling works, because you have this talent right here, it also is giving you, because remember it turns into 13.28 intellect after all the percent intellect buffs. It actually gives you 3.32 spell power. Okay, so 10 intellect gives you, so intellect gives you about a third of spell power after all of the percent increases to int, if that makes any sense. So you've got that going for it. Also, 13.28 intellect equals 0.166% critical strike chance. So that means that every 100 intellect you get equals 1.6% crit. I think that's a little bit maybe simpler to understand. So every like 60 int is like a percent critical strike chance. You know, which is almost an extra percent of damage. Also, one more thing you need to factor in with intellect is it turns out that in my mage's gear, this will be a different equation for everybody obviously, but in my mage's gear, 10 intellect equals about 1.4 mana per 5. And so that, you know, when you factor that out over the course of 2 minutes, equals to be, I have it written down here as 33.6 mana. So you add that on top of the 320, and that's how much extra mana you can expect in a fight. When you calculate your total mana, with evocate and everything, externals, your mana gem for being a mage, which you can use every 2 minutes, you know, I think I had, what was it? Yeah, I came out to having 34,000, and this is factoring clear casting as well. 34,640 mana per fight on average on my mage is what I can field currently on my mage's gear, which is half Kara plus pre-raid bis. And I feel like that's fair, right? So, okay, this is really long-winded, but all this is to say that 10 intellect, just 10 more intellect, according to my math, comes out to be 1.4% DPS increase. Which is nuts. Absolutely insane. So you have to imagine, okay, when you have 800 or rather 1,000 intellect raid buffed, and the gnome racial comes along and adds 5% to that, that's 50 more int, right? And we just said 10 is 1.4%. So 5 times 1.4%. You know, I mean, according to my math, the gnome racial is a 7% DPS increase for Arcane, assuming that you will go in the fight, and the fight lasts at least 2 minutes. Now, obviously, this doesn't take into account your filler, right? Your filler still does something like half your DPS at a much more efficient rate. So maybe, I don't know, like this number gets like cut by like a third, you know, because your filler is still somewhat good. So maybe it comes up to being something like this, which is why I feel like the gnome racial is like probably about a 5% DPS increase. But yeah. Also, I mean, it's multiplicative on all the other values, so 5% on top of the already improved 15% on top of the already improved at 10% just makes things insane. Also, another thing that I found was that if you're going to be stacking all intellect, surprise, surprise, the Spellfire gear becomes very, very strong for a very, very long time. And it's sort of this self-replicating or self-fulfilling prophecy, because as you're building more and more intellect, it means that Spellfire means more and more and more. And then as you factor in the Spellfire into your stat weights, this pushes intellect even higher, which means you want to build more of them. You build more of it, well, now this makes Spellfire even... Yeah, it's this snowball effect, which could potentially lead you down some really strange gearing options, but I think it's kind of cool. I think it's kind of cool that your phase 1, you can craft 3 of your bis pieces. So I think you build Spellfire, and I think it's better than all of the Kara alternatives and all of the phase 1 alternatives, pretty much. So that's pretty cool. I also did the math, and I really do think that your best meta gem, strangely enough, is actually the Insightful Earthstorm Diamond. It gives 12 int, which, as we know, intellect is worth a fuck ton. But it also gives you something like a 2 or a 4% chance to gain 300 mana on spellcasts. And because you're spamming these Arcane Blasts at a very, very fast rate, and you have such a massive mana pool, you have one of the highest cast per combat ratios in the game, and you're one of the few classes that can directly turn mana into more DPS. So it's close, but I think it actually beats out where is it? Everyone goes for this one, the chaotic one. Spell crit plus spell damage. Now obviously the spell crit and crit damage is bis for the fire spec, but that's a whole nother gearing thing that we're not really going to talk about. Okay, so it has some pretty strict gymming requirements, but you can almost meet all of these. You can meet all of these gym requirements just from the Spellfire gear alone. So just between, you know, the Incanter's cowl or whatever your helmet is, and just the Spellfire gear alone, if you don't care about the socket bonuses and you don't care about the gyms, can meet that requirement for the gym. And by the way, I did factor in the loss of intellect that you will have to sacrifice to fulfill the requirement of the red gyms and the blue gyms. I did factor in the loss of points that you'll have to go for going for hybrid gyms. And it still won. Barely, but it still won. So yeah, I think this is what you go. Moving on. Obviously, gym slots are worth a fuck ton. 8 intellect is worth 11 points. So every gym socket, in theory, is worth 1.1% increased DPS. Which is nuts. Absolutely nuts if you think about it. So that tilts things pretty significantly. If you want to see my stats, my stat weights, here they are. Feel free to like pause the video and save this to your 70 upgrades. This is my stat weights after I was partially Kara geared out. So know that the stats weights will change. Obviously, you know, in the beginning, hit rating, spell damage is worth a little bit more, but when you can start lasting longer in fights, actually it's kind of a hard one. The only thing that really switches around here a lot, I feel like, is the spell hit, spell haste, and spirit. So as you get more and more intellect, spirit, because of mage armor and concentration, actually starts to push into a pretty high value, eventually surpassing spell damage, ironically enough, because you have so much int, spirit gives so much MP5, and because so much of it is allowed to tick while casting, it strangely comes up pretty high in the equation. That was a fun kind of eye-opener. Yeah, so spell damage is decent, but it's ultimately not where most of your damage comes from. A lot of your damage comes from the base damage of Arcane Blast in the beginning. As you get more and more intellect, spell damage will eventually kind of, you know, work its way up. Or rather, not go down in points. I feel like these are fairly decent stats to copy, but a lot will change eventually. But yeah, this is basically a pretty geared mage who's got some carapaces and can last 2 minutes of just pure Arcane Blast spamming, is where this character is at and these stats are at. And I would definitely reevaluate the stats every once in a while. I don't know how you guys would do that. No offense, but it's quite some spurgy math, and I don't really have the equations to teach here. You sort of just have to go by a stat by stat value. Ask yourself what 10 of this stat means now, and then try to figure it out. It's pretty difficult, I'm not gonna lie. Also, stats mean different things based off gear length. You know, if we're just talking about a 1 minute fight, well, hey, you know, intellect, spirit, mana per 5, that shit probably doesn't matter that much, right? Likewise, we're talking about a 30-second fight, it definitely doesn't matter at all. And if we're talking about a 5 minute fight, well, now all of a sudden spell damage doesn't mean that much, right? It just depends on how long the fight is, but ultimately I did my math based off 2 minute fights, and I think that's what I like. Those are shorter fights, but it already pushed intellect higher than most people stack it, so you're already lasting longer, and ultimately you still have your filler to fall back on, which is more efficient, right? So that's either the arcane missiles, that's the fireball filler, or the frostbolt filler, like I said before. So you always have that in your back pocket that you can sort of just whip out and basically be mana neutral and still do like a third of your DPS, right? Or whatever. So, is there really anything else to talk about? So I think the professions that you want to be are tailoring and enchanting. And there's a reason for it. I don't know why it doesn't have it on here, but there is an enchant for 4 stats. The 4 stats is better than the 12 spell damage. So you can enchant your rings if you're an enchanter in TBC and give yourself 4 stats and 4 stats. So that's 8 intellect, 8 spirit, 8 stam, yada yada yada. So obviously 8 intellect and 8 spirit is a pretty massive deal. That's going to come out to be like 2% increased DPS. It's significant in my opinion, and it's worth it. Tailoring, obviously you need tailoring for Spellfire, and the passive will not work if you drop tailoring. So you're pretty much stuck to tailoring and enchanting, which is kind of unfortunate because there's some really good options for trinkets that are jewel crafting. Like this is a very good early game option. The Living Ruby Serpent is incredibly good for us. It's just an intellect stamina piece with like a 5-minute DPS increase button. But because, you know, you're not going to really get a chance to use trinkets more than like one time anyways, it's not that bad. So you just macro the trinket in with, you know, Icy Veins and Arcane Power, and you do get a decent portion out of that bonus spell damage part. But the main thing is that free intellect. Now this, I don't know if you can craft and then switch out of. You might be able to. That's something to investigate. So maybe the play is you're tailoring, you're tailoring jewel crafting as a start. You dump a bunch of money, you make the figurine as jewel crafting, you dump jewel crafting, you become an enchanter, so then you can eventually enchant your rings. And then I guess you just, maybe you just have this thing made and you're good to go, and it doesn't require you to continue to have jewel crafting. That might be the play if you're ultra spurgy, guys. This is for the absolute spurgs out there, because eventually this figurine does get beat out, but only when you start receiving some Karazhan gear. You eventually start using different trinkets and whatnot. And yeah, so, but I just threw in some okay trinkets. That unfortunately there's not too many good options for trinkets for you. Strangely enough, there's some interesting choices, although you might have to murder a healer over it. Shifter's Nexus Horn I actually think is pretty decent. Where is it? This thing? There's a trinket, I'm not quite sure what it was called, but it allows mana regeneration to continue while casting. And you'd have to murder a healer to get it. I don't know where I see it on here. All the points are sort of messed up for trinkets because they can't quite there it is, Bengal. So I forgot what the percent chance is, but it allows a chance for your mana regeneration to continue while casting. Yeah, this would allow the rest of your percent of mana regeneration to continue while casting. I think it's maybe 15%. But it happens so often that this buff is kept up like 50% of the time. So it's like something like 7.5%, or maybe it's like 5% average of your mana regeneration will just kind of continue while casting. And that plus this on-use spirit is enough extra mana in a fight to be worth it. But this is kind of a healer trinket, so you'll be hard-pressed to ever get this. You have a lot of interesting options for trinkets as an arcane mage, but none of them necessarily feel too good. One of the ones that wins out is the one from Karazhan, where every 3 crits equals a lightning bolt. You get a lot of free crit from intellect, and so you'll be able to get like 30% crit without really even trying. But yeah, I would say the most thing I'm pretty unsure on is trinkets, and I spent a lot of time doing math for it, but none of the trinkets really work out too well. On-use trinkets are pretty good because you can combine it with Icy Veins and Power, whatever the hell, not Power Infusion, but Arcane Power. So those are pretty good. So stuff like this, I think are pretty decent. These would be okay, right? as far as weapon, your options are kind of limited, because you want intellect so bad that it pushes a lot of these staffs like sort of out of the way. One-handed, if you include Karazhan, there's a really good one off the Prince, right? This guy right here, and so this would obviously be your choice. But I think I want to say, what's a good two-handed option that's not like ridiculous to get? Oh, the Aldor staff. Yeah, the Aldor staff is goddamn near Biss. It just gives 46 intellect. So get this, everybody on their mother says Scryer. I don't think Scryer is actually good for Arcane Mage, because you don't need the hit, and the only reason you went Scryer was the Trinket. So you can actually get your pre-raid Biss before Spellfire Robe from being Aldor. Look how good this thing is. This thing is actually worth literally 2% more DPS over the Spellfire Robe, just from the base stats of the Trinket, the gems alone. So this is a very good robe to have. I mean, insanely good robe before Spellfire Robe, which is why you build Spellfire Robe last. The first thing you build is Spellfire Belt, because it never gets beat by anything, like ever. See, it just a boss of Gruul's Lair. That's it. And then you build the gloves, and then you build the robe. Let's see. Oh, another thing, enchants. I guess we should talk about those. You want the intellect enchant for weapon, not the spell damage one, obviously. Stats on chest, intellect bracers, spell pin here. I think, oh yeah, there's another really weird thing. The Glyph of the Outcast is technically a tiny bit better than Glyph of Power. But if you're low on hit rating, Glyph of Power wins. I would say, in general, the Glyph of Power is probably your safer bet. Right, spell damage and hit, you can't go wrong with that. But technically, the intellect with all the little mage buffs, and I think the intellect wins out when you get super geared, because the intellect turns into a lot of spell damage for you, and maybe you don't need to hit. So this is definitely one of those flexible enchants that changes based off your gear. If you found yourself with too much hit, you go with Outcast. If you don't have any hit, then you go Glyph of Power. You don't need much hit as an Arcane Mage, but it pays to kind of just be able to show up with a little bit on your own. Also, you get the spell hit from gloves, so kind of already have some there. Okay, moving on. Boot enchant, you gotta pick whatever. 5 spirits, fine. I think that's about it for gearing. I think it's tier 5. The tier 5 set bonus is really interesting. It makes your Arcane Blast do and cost 20% more mana. So it's kind of like a miniature permanent Arcane Power. Which means that there's a future for intellect even into tier 5. So I think you're always stacking intellect for the rest of the game. I think you're going to always be able to find a way to go therefore intellect just like, it's like stonks, you know? Just keeps going up and up and up. And if you keep building more and more int, well then guess what? Spellfire just continues to be more and more disgusting. So you might be wearing Spellfire for a very, very long time. So yeah. And when you try to make the bonuses work for your metagym, make sure that you try to connect the bonuses that actually give you like a DPS increase. You know, stuff like spell damage, spell hit, intellect, right? One of the cool things about the Akanai robes too is, or maybe it's not these. I don't know. There's a gear piece. I forgot which one it is, where the socket bonus is intellect. I forgot which one though. It's been so long. Yeah, we're already up to an hour and 3 minutes. So yeah, I guess I could get to rotation, although there really isn't one. You just sort of open up, you know. You can use Presence of Mind if you want to get your first charge of Arcane Blast out of the way, so you're not spending 2.5 seconds casting it. You want to try to cast Evocate with Icy Veins, so Evocate becomes a 6-second cast. So if you do an 8-second Evocate, it'll get rid of your this. So you may or may not want it. This is up to you. You gotta figure this out. So you gotta be thinking: do I want to use part of my Icy Veins on Evocate? One, make sure that you don't overcap mana, obviously. 2, you need to assess the situation. If the fight's getting close to an end, then yes, you do want to evocate, assuming you're with Icy Veins, because you want to be able to get back to Arcane Blasting. So here's the whole thing. If you evocate with Icy Veins, you can get it off so fast that you're able to recast Arcane Blast and not lose your charges. So obviously, that's a DPS decision, not an efficiency decision. If you have a very, very, very long time left to go, then maybe you don't do that. But also, here's the thing. If it's a very, very, very long fight, I actually suggest not using Icy Veins and Arcane Power. It depends. If you have a Trinket, then you can still combine Arcane Power and Icy Veins with all of your Arcane Blast spam. Sure, go for it. But let's say you don't have an on-use Trinket. I actually think the play is to use that on Arcane Missiles or your filler, because it's a way to do good DPS with relatively spending almost no mana. Because you have to remember, these aren't a damage per mana ratio increase. Right? Icy Veins and Arcane Power, they don't increase your damage per mana spent. They just increase your DPS by a fuck ton. Okay? So if you can't sustain their usage with Arcane Blast in a fight anyways, why use it on Arcane Blast other than just to make your PP hard? Okay? So you would use this with like Magic Missiles, or if you're the Magic Missile spec, Fireball if you're the Fireball spec, or Frostbolt with the Frost spec. And I would use it to make my evocate a lot faster. At least the Icy Veins part, right? Because Spell Haste is a bit of a meme in that it can only ever help you if you have the mana for it to help you. That makes sense. Like, Spell Haste directly relies on your ability to get more mana more efficiently than stacking spell damage, right? Because you got to think about it. Not only if you get Spell Haste, you need more mana, you then have to build Spell Haste and mana more efficiently than what you could have turned those stats into if it was just spell damage, right? Because it all comes down to damage per mana spent and how much mana you have, or versus how long the fight is. So there's just so much awesome gearing decisions on a per fight basis that if you're a real god, it has these massive swinging differences to your DPS. And I really, really like that. And the answer that I found was sort of stack as much mana, cast Arcane Blast until I get to like a third of the mana after an evocate, and from there I can make a on-the-fly decision with what filler I've decided to be, and then I can kind of match my mana to the remainder of the boss's HP. And the goal is you end the fight with like a final fire flame blast or the final arcane blast or whatever your last spell is. You're just dead fucking oom. Mana gem's on cooldown, evocate's on cooldown, everything's on cooldown, you're dead oom, and the boss just perfectly dies. And you do the absolute maximum DPS. It's this little mini game. You're watching your mana, you're watching the boss's health, but at some point in time, you have to make that decision to switch out of the high gear, aka spamming Arcane Blast, and switch into the chill mode, right? Take it slow, Now the idea is, with gearing, you're trying to make sure that never happens. That's the beauty of Arcane Blast, is you just want to be Arcane Blasting all the time. And since stacking intellect, especially if you're a gnome, is so efficient, and it's so much easier to get intellect than spell damage, or it's so much easier to get an impactful amount of intellect over spell damage, I should say. And what it does to your character, how do I phrase this? It's getting an extra Arcane Blast in a fight requires less intellect than that damage would be to get through spell damage, if that makes any sense. And that's the ridiculous equation I had to do, because ultimately, it begs the question, like, why not just go a Arcane Missiles build? You've got increased spell damage here and just stack spell damage, and you do close to the damage of Arcane Blast, but you wouldn't beat Arcane Blast. However, your efficiency per mana spent would be out of this world. So there could be an Arcane Missiles build where you're all in on damage, and you rely on the raid to give you enough buffs to sustain the mana usage, and you just don't really get that much, mana. But I think because of the natural bonuses of intellect so many times, plus, you know, the Spellfire plus the Gnome, it pushes you into this intellect, and then the only playstyle that can actually use that is supported by that is Arcane Blast spamming. And so that it was just an absolute blast to Theorcraft on the private server, and the numbers come out to be quite insane. So even early game, without much gear, and before I'd even gotten Kara gear, I was pretty much able to reliably always do 1000 DPS, which early game is very good. You know, we're talking like pre-raid Biss being able to just pump 1000 DPS for 2 minutes straight is absolutely insane. And as my damage was increasing, I'm sure that if I was to do a raid right now in my gear, it'd probably be more like 1100, maybe 1200. When fights ended early, even before my first time doing Kara, no gear from Kara, we did the play fight, and it was over so fast that me and the mage both went at the last second, and he did 1600 DPS as an arcane mage, and I did 1450, and he was in full Kara gear. So I always thought it was odd that man was in full Kara gear and only managed to pull out like 150 DPS on me when I had so much gear to go, and I didn't even have enchants. Like I was really I was lowballing. I didn't even have the better leg enchant. I was missing stuff. I didn't have Spellfire completed, and I was able to do that much DPS because it was such a short fight. And he had to, even though it was a short fight, I had more intellect than him, so he had to start at the end of it. He had to start conserving mana, and so I saw him casting Frostbolts, and he lost all of his DPS there. And I realized there that it's just not worth it. If he had made more intellect, he would have been able to last the whole fight, and instead of doing shitty Frostbolt DPS, he could have been, you know, still spamming Arcane Blast like a Chad. So yeah, but he was a really good mage. So eventually, in my opinion, the feature is that you never cast any of this shit in the first place. And I guess you're still just expecting to cold snap for a second Icy Veins, just because it's another way to turn essentially mana into damage. But yeah, I guess that's it, guys. Yeah, in layman's terms, in AoE, assuming ads are not, so this is your rotation in AoE, assuming ads are not going to die within 10 seconds. It's max rank Arcane Explosion, although you can down rank it early on when your gear sucks. By the way, you should down rank it early on when your gear sucks. And you tailor the down rank to whatever your gear is. You know, if you gotta go 1 rank down below max, 2 ranks down below max, 3, you gotta do what you gotta do. That's what I did. And as you get better and better gear, you can start up ranking it. But anyways, cast the appropriate rank of Arcane Explosion, so you get a clear casting proc. First clear casting proc, so Presence of Mind, Flame Strike. Then you keep going back to Arcane Explosioning. Next clear casting proc is Cone of Cold, and you alternate. Next one Flame Strike, next one Cone of Cold. If the ads are not going, now that's the condition if the ads are always going to live 10 seconds or more. If the ads are not going to live like 10 seconds, then you dispense with the Flame Striking, assuming this is the important part, assuming you don't have Presence of Mind, right? If Presence of Mind is always up and you get a clear casting proc, almost every situation it's Flame Strike instantly, right? Unless the ads are going to really die in like 1 second. Then you probably want the absolute just instant damage of Cone of Cold. So it's a decision that you have to make between deciding whether or not it's worth to hard cast Flame Strike versus just throwing your 100% crit damage plus 50% crit damage plus 30% critical strike chance clear casting Cone of Cold out, right? And it was a fascinating and absolutely awesome experience for me. And there's tons of ways if you really wanted to go down the route where you could get like a lot more DPS to your AoE if you wanted to just be like a meme lord and just do AoE DPS. And I thought that was really interesting. You know, you could potentially increase Cone of Cold's damage right here by 45%. I mean, I told you my Cone of Cold's rating for 2k. You could be seeing Cone of Cold's hit for 3k a pop. Every clear casting proc basically, that would be nuts. So yeah, it was a really, really fun experience AoEing, because it was like arcane damage, arcane damage, arcane damage, fire, arcane damage, arcane damage, arcane damage. Oh, clear casting proc, Cone of Cold. You know, And the fire and frost spells always pulled aggro, which was kind of an issue, but it was always worth it. It was so much fun. Ultimately, just Arcane Exploding doesn't pull that much aggro because of the minus 40%, and it still cranks DPS. So if threat is an issue, then you kind of, you know, you gotta give yourself a slap on the wrist. Don't be a bad boy, just use Arcane Explosion. Holy shit, this is a long video. Fuck, I feel like I didn't even discuss anything. Jesus Christ. Let me just quickly search the stats. Yeah, you don't need much hit because Arcane gives so much hit. That's why it's so low on the prio. MP5 is worth a bit if it's a 2-minute fight. You saw the stats. That's good. This is probably my pre-raid BIS setup. I haven't, like, you know, made it 100% perfect. I don't know. Hit me up if you have any questions about Arcane Mage, or even the big crit fire build, which I have only really theorycrafted but never really put into practice via like raid environment. I spent a lot of time on the dummy doing DPS just to check to make sure I was right about my theory, and I was. So, okay, that's the end of the video, guys. If you're a Spurg and really like Arcane Mage, or you plan to play Arcane Mage, and you watch this whole fucking thing, hey, kudos to you. I don't know a single soul that would sit through an hour and a half or hour and 15 minutes of me rambling about Arcane Mage, but it was a blast to sit here and basically talk to myself. And so yeah, I can do one of these, guys, if people have special requests for any of the healers too. I think that would be fun, and I wouldn't mind making a pretty long video about that and just, you know, sort of explaining what their stat weights would look like and how it interacts with their spell ranks and whatnot, you know. So yeah, I think it's kind of cool that I kind of gave you guys a different spin, 2 different playstyles, and then within the playstyle, there's alternate fillers that I thought is really interesting, with potentially a completely different alternate way of just using arcane missiles too, and they all kind of come out to being close to the same DPS. So if you want to just cast arcane missiles, you can do that. If you want to just cast Arcane Blast, you could do that. If you want your filler to be Arcane, Fire, or Frost, all of them come out to basically being close to the same amount of DPS with different perks on each one. Different strengths and weaknesses. Technically, Fire's filler is higher DPS and about higher efficiency, but makes more threat, and makes your AoE worse and makes it harder to spec into, and you lose second Icy Veins. Frost is really good efficiency. Not going to do more DPS than Fire, but you get the second Icy Veins, good efficiency. And with the Arcane one, it works better on lower gear, and makes less threat, and it suffers 0 pushback. So, and you can take advantage of clear casting procs with the normal rotation by using Arcane Missiles, and there's a lot of synergy with that. So hopefully that was interesting, and you guys learned something. I don't know. I really feel like I just barely scratched the surface. Okay, thanks for watching, guys.